There are some doors that should never be opened, and the one Sarah Chen found behind the false wall in the cellar of Blackwood Manor on that cold November morning in 1992 was exactly that kind of door. She had come to the estate outside Charleston, South Carolina, as part of a team hired by the Historic Preservation Society to conduct a structural survey before the planned restoration could begin. Blackwood Manor had stood empty for nearly 40 years, slowly crumbling into itself, its once grand rooms surrendering to rot and decay. The property had been donated to the society by the last surviving member of the Blackwood family, a woman named Virginia Blackwood Morrison, who had died at 93, leaving behind a will with one peculiar specification. Nothing was to be removed, nothing altered, nothing disturbed until a complete historical survey had been conducted. Sarah was 28, a structural engineer who specialized in historic buildings. She had grown up in San Francisco, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had instilled in her both a respect for tradition and an appreciation for the opportunities they had worked so hard to secure. She believed deeply that old buildings were repositories of memory, that they contained within their walls the stories of the people who had built them, lived in them, suffered and celebrated in them. Blackwood Manor was a masterpiece of federal architecture, built in 1829 by Thomas Blackwood, a rice planter whose fortune had been secured through the labor of more than 200 enslaved people. The house was 3 stories of red brick with white columns and a sweeping double staircase. But by 1992, the roof had failed in several places. Plaster was falling from ceilings in great sheets, and floorboards were warped and rotted. In some rooms, the floor had collapsed entirely. Sarah had spent 3 weeks documenting the condition of the main floors. The cellar had been last on her checklist, and she had been putting it off. There was something about Blackwood Manor's cellar that made her uneasy, a feeling she could not articulate, just a sense that it held something that did not want to be found. She finally descended the narrow wooden stairs on a gray November morning, carrying a powerful flashlight and wearing heavy boots. The cellar was low-ceilinged and damp, with a dirt floor and rough brick walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. She worked her way through each room systematically, examining foundation walls for cracks, checking floor joists for rot. But in the 3rd room, tucked into a corner where her flashlight barely reached, she noticed something odd. The brick wall did not quite match the others. The mortar was a slightly different color, and the pattern seemed irregular. She moved closer, running her gloved hand over the surface, and then she felt it. A slight give in one section, a sense that there was empty space behind. She pressed harder and heard a soft crumbling sound. When she pushed against one of the bricks, it shifted slightly inward. Sarah's pulse quickened. False walls were not uncommon in houses of this period. People had hidden valuables, documents, even fugitive slaves during the Civil War. Whatever was behind this wall had been deliberately concealed. She worked carefully, using a small crowbar to gently pry at the loose brick. After 20 minutes, she had created an opening about 18 inches square. She shone her flashlight through the gap and found herself looking at a small room, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, with a ceiling so low anyone inside would have had to crouch. The room was empty except for a single item in the far corner. She widened the opening until she could squeeze through, then climbed into the hidden space. The air inside was stale and undisturbed, as if no one had breathed it in more than a century. Sarah stood hunched beneath the low ceiling, sweeping her flashlight around. The walls were bare brick, the floor packed dirt. There were no windows, no ventilation. Anyone trapped here would have been in complete darkness. Then her light fell on the object in the corner. It was a wooden trunk, small and plain, made of pine darkened with age. The trunk was closed but not locked, its simple metal clasp rusted but intact. Sarah knew she should call Dr. William Foster, the historian overseeing the project, should document everything before opening it. But her hands were already reaching for the clasp, already lifting the lid. Inside were papers, hundreds of sheets, some loose, some bound with thread or ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, covered with handwriting in dark ink. Sarah lifted the top sheet carefully. It was a letter, dated March 1858. My dearest sister, I write to you in the greatest secrecy and with the heaviest of hearts. What I am about to confide must never be spoken of to another living soul. I have discovered something terrible within these walls, something that challenges everything I believed about my husband, my family, and the society in which we live. I am afraid, Margaret. I am afraid of what will happen if the truth is ever revealed, and I am afraid of what will happen if it is not. The letter was signed, Catherine Blackwood. Sarah sat back on her heels. Catherine Blackwood had been the wife of Thomas Blackwood, Jr., son of the man who built the house. She had married him in 1852 despite her Boston family's objections to her marrying a Southern planter. She had died in 1859 at 31. The cause of death had been recorded as childbed fever, though Catherine had never had children. Sarah set the letter aside and picked up the next document. It was a journal, bound in leather that had faded to mottled brown. She opened it to the first page. This journal belongs to Catherine Marshall Blackwood. It contains a true and faithful account of events that occurred at Blackwood Manor between 1856 and 1858. I write these words knowing they may never be read, that this journal may remain hidden until long after everyone involved has passed from this world. But I cannot remain silent. If you are reading this, if you have found this journal in its hiding place, then I beg you to read it with an open mind. Judge me if you must, but judge also those who created the circumstances that made such terrible choices necessary. Sarah checked her watch. Nearly noon. She had been in the cellar for 3 hours. She should go upstairs, call Dr. Foster, report what she had found. But she could not close the journal, could not resist reading enough to understand what Catherine had felt compelled to record. She turned to the first entry, dated June 1856. I have been mistress of Blackwood Manor for 4 years, and I am only beginning to understand the true nature of the institution upon which my comfort depends. When I married Thomas, I told myself that slavery in practice would be different from slavery in principle. I told myself these lies because I loved my husband, because I could not bear to acknowledge the moral compromise I was making. But I can no longer maintain these illusions. I have seen enslaved people whipped for minor infractions, seen families separated and sold, seen women forced to submit to men who owned them. And now I have discovered something that has shattered whatever illusions remained. There is a young woman named Hannah who works in the house. She is perhaps 18, with skin the color of copper and eyes that hold both intelligence and deep sadness. Last week, I discovered that Hannah can read and write. I found her in the library late one evening, holding one of Thomas's books. When she saw me, she dropped the book and fell to her knees, begging me not to tell the master. I assured her I would keep her secret, and I asked how she had learned. She told me that Thomas's mother had taught her in secret when she was a child. But what Hannah told me next has haunted me every day since. She is not just a slave in this house. She is Thomas's half-sister. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Sarah who had been forced to bear children to Thomas's father. Hannah is one of those children, born into slavery despite being the biological daughter of the master. And when Hannah's mother tried to protect her daughter from the same fate, she was sold away to Louisiana. Hannah has not seen her mother in 8 years. I confronted Thomas, and he confirmed it is true. He spoke of it casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my distress. But I cannot accept it. I cannot live in this house knowing that the young woman who brings me tea is my husband's half-sister, kept in bondage by her own family. I cannot pretend this is acceptable. I have decided to take action. I know I cannot free Hannah through legal means. Everything I own belongs to my husband, but I will find a way. Hannah deserves freedom, and I will do whatever is necessary to help her achieve it, even if it costs me everything. Sarah continued reading, transfixed. Catherine documented her growing friendship with Hannah, the books she lent in secret, the plans they began making for escape. Catherine wrote about contacting her sister in Boston, about letters exchanged using a childhood code, about arrangements being made to receive Hannah if she could make it north. But the journal also revealed the terrible obstacles. The plantation was isolated, surrounded by swamps. Hannah would need forged papers, money for travel, contacts along the way. The penalty for failed escape was brutal. Whipping, branding, sale to the sugar plantations where life expectancy was measured in years. Catherine wrote about stealing small amounts of money from Thomas's desk, about forging free papers, about finding a ship captain who might transport Hannah to Philadelphia for the right price. Then, in February 1858, everything changed. February 14th, 1858. It is done. Hannah left 3 nights ago, hidden in a wagon to Charleston. From there, she was to board a ship to Philadelphia, traveling as a free woman of color. I have had no word since, and I am tormented by fear that she has been captured. Thomas has been searching everywhere, has posted advertisements for her return. He is furious at her disappearance, not because he cares for her as a sister, but because she represents valuable property. He has questioned all the other enslaved people, has had several whipped trying to extract information, and he has begun to question me. I have lied to him repeatedly, and each lie feels like a stone added to the weight I carry. But I cannot tell him the truth. To do so would betray Hannah, ensure her capture. I would rather die than do that. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The entries grew darker, more fragmented. Catherine wrote about her growing illness, about Thomas's increasing suspicions, about her isolation from the other white families who seemed to sense she had transgressed some fundamental boundary. Then came the entry that made Sarah's breath catch. September 18th, 1858. A letter arrived from Margaret, hidden inside a book shipment. Hannah arrived safely in Philadelphia. She made it to freedom. She is living with my sister, working as a seamstress, well and happy. She has changed her name to Anna Freeman, a name she chose for herself. I wept when I read this. Hannah is free. All the planning, all the fear, all the lies, it was worth it. She will never again be owned by anyone. But Margaret warns me to be careful. Thomas has placed advertisements in northern newspapers offering a reward. She has advised Hannah to remain hidden and warned me to destroy all evidence of our correspondence. But I cannot. I need to preserve a record of what happened. I have decided to create a hiding place in the cellar where these documents can be concealed. I will wall up the room before sealing it. If I am fortunate, I will live to retrieve them when slavery is abolished. But if not, at least they will survive, will bear witness to what happened here. Sarah turned to the final entries, her heart pounding. November 3rd, 1858. Thomas knows. He found Margaret's letters somehow, intercepted them before I could retrieve them. He confronted me this evening, his voice shaking with rage. He called me a traitor, a thief. He said I had stolen his property, violated the sacred trust between husband and wife. He threatened to have me committed to an asylum, arguing that no rational woman would have done what I did. I did not deny it. I told him I would do it again, that helping Hannah was the only truly moral action I had taken since arriving here. This enraged him further. He struck me, and I fell. When I looked up, I saw not the man I had married, but a stranger capable of terrible cruelty. He has locked me in my room. He says I will remain here until I agree to write to my sister demanding Hannah's return. He says if I refuse, he will have me declared insane and committed. But I will not write that letter. I will not betray Hannah. If he commits me to an asylum, so be it. I have done what I believe to be right. The entries became sparse after that. Brief notes about confinement, about a physician who declared her hysterical, about meals brought by enslaved women who looked at her with pity and fear, about deteriorating health, fever, and weakness that worsened each day. The final entry was dated March 1859, and it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. March 12th, 1859. I am dying. The fever has left me too weak to rise. The physician says childbed fever, though I have never been with child. But I know the truth. The tea they bring me tastes bitter. My hands shake uncontrollably. My vision blurs. I am being poisoned. I have confided in Patience, one of the enslaved women who has shown me kindness. She has agreed to take these documents to the hiding place after my death, to wall up the room so no one will find them until long after we have all passed. To whoever finds this journal, tell Hannah's story. Tell the world she existed, that she was intelligent and brave, that she deserved freedom. Tell the world that slavery was not benevolent, that it destroyed families and corrupted souls. Tell the world that there were those who resisted, who chose conscience over compliance. I die knowing I did the right thing. May God grant freedom to all who are still in bondage. Sarah closed the journal and sat in the darkness, tears streaming down her face. Catherine Blackwood had been poisoned by her own husband, her death recorded as natural causes. But she had left this witness to the truth, trusting that someday someone would find it. Sarah carefully gathered the documents and placed them in her backpack, handling them like glass. She climbed back through the opening and made her way upstairs, her mind racing. She needed to contact Dr. Foster immediately, get these documents to an archivist, begin the research that would verify Catherine's account, and trace what happened to Hannah. But as she emerged from the cellar into the gray November afternoon, she felt something else. A presence, perhaps, or just the weight of history pressing down. She turned and looked back at the house, at its empty windows staring like blind eyes. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure in one of the upper windows. A young woman in a white dress, her hand pressed against the glass. Sarah blinked, and the figure was gone. She shook her head, telling herself it was just a trick of the light, just her imagination running wild after reading Catherine's tragic story. But as she walked to her car, she could not shake the feeling that Catherine Blackwood was still there, still waiting, still hoping that someone would finally tell her story. The door in the cellar had been opened, and the secrets of Blackwood Manor were only beginning to emerge. Sarah Chen did not sleep that night. She sat in her hotel room in Charleston, Catherine Blackwood's journal open before her, reading the final entry over and over until the words blurred together. I am being poisoned. 3 simple words that transformed everything. This was not just a historical curiosity about the Underground Railroad. This was evidence of murder, carefully concealed for 134 years. Dr. William Foster had examined the hidden room and documents with the careful attention of a scholar witnessing something extraordinary. He had agreed the discovery was significant, had arranged for the documents to be properly preserved. But he had also warned Sarah about jumping to conclusions, about the need for verification, about the dangers of letting emotional response override historical methodology. Sarah had nodded, had agreed to all his protocols. But even as she spoke, her mind had been made up. She was taking a leave of absence from her engineering work. She was going to Philadelphia to find out what had happened to Hannah. The question that tormented her through the sleepless night was simpler and more terrible than any historical puzzle. Had Catherine died for nothing? Had Hannah been captured during her escape, returned to Blackwood Manor, subjected to the brutal punishment awaiting fugitive slaves? Or had she made it to freedom, built a life in Philadelphia, justified the terrible price Catherine had paid? Sarah booked a flight for the next afternoon. She spent the morning photographing every page of Catherine's journal and letters, creating a complete digital record. Then she carefully packed the original documents in archival boxes and delivered them to Dr. Foster at the South Carolina Historical Society, where they would be preserved in climate-controlled storage while she continued her research. The flight to Philadelphia left at 2. Sarah spent the 3 hours reading through Catherine's letters to her sister Margaret, studying the elaborate code they had developed, trying to understand the network of people who had made Hannah's escape possible. The sisters had been careful, referring to Hannah as merchandise, to freedom as delivery, to Philadelphia as the warehouse. Even if the letters had been intercepted, it would have been difficult to prove what they really discussed. But someone had figured it out. Someone had discovered Catherine's role in Hannah's escape, and that someone had killed her for it. The plane landed just after 6. Sarah took a taxi directly to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, arriving as it was closing. She showed her credentials to the security guard, explained she was researching an urgent matter related to the Underground Railroad. The guard made a phone call, and 15 minutes later, an archivist appeared. Dr. Rebecca Winters was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and intelligent, skeptical eyes that assessed Sarah carefully as she explained what she had found at Blackwood Manor. Sarah showed her photographs of Catherine's journal, described the hidden room, outlined the story of Hannah's escape. Dr. Winters listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Sarah finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that made Sarah's heart sink. The Historical Society had extensive records of Underground Railroad operations in Philadelphia, but most used code names or initials to protect the people involved. Finding one specific fugitive slave, especially one who might have changed her name, would be like searching for a ghost. Many people had passed through Philadelphia on their way to Canada or other destinations. Many had stayed only briefly before moving on. The chances of finding definitive proof that Hannah had arrived here, much less that she had survived and thrived, were slim. Sarah felt desperation rising in her chest. She had come to Philadelphia expecting answers, expecting to find Hannah's trail clearly marked in historical records. The possibility that the trail might not exist, that Hannah might have vanished into history as completely as thousands of other fugitive slaves, was something she had not prepared herself for. But Dr. Winters agreed to help. The society closed at 6, but she made an exception, leading Sarah up to the 4th-floor research room. They began with records from known abolitionists active in Philadelphia in the 1850s, working methodically through boxes of letters and documents. For 3 hours, they found nothing. Sarah's initial excitement curdled into anxiety, then into something close to despair. Every document she examined told stories of other people, other escapes, other lives. But none mentioned Hannah or Anna Freeman, or anyone matching the description from Catherine's journal. At 9 o'clock, Dr. Winters suggested they stop for the night, continue fresh in the morning. Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to keep searching, but she could see the exhaustion in the older woman's face. She agreed reluctantly, and Dr. Winters gave her a key card for the research room with permission to return early. Sarah walked back to her hotel through the cold November night, her mind churning. What if Hannah had never made it to Philadelphia? What if the letter Catherine received from her sister Margaret had been a fabrication, a kind lie meant to give Catherine comfort in her final days? What if Hannah had been captured somewhere between Charleston and Philadelphia, had been returned to Thomas Blackwood, had suffered punishment that Sarah could not bear to imagine? She lay awake in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Catherine dying in that locked room at Blackwood Manor, believing Hannah had achieved freedom, never knowing for certain. The not knowing seemed almost worse than death itself. At 4 in the morning, Sarah gave up on sleep. She returned to the Historical Society, let herself into the research room, and resumed her search. She worked through box after box of documents as dawn broke over Philadelphia, finding dozens of references to fugitive slaves, but nothing about Hannah. By 10 o'clock, she was ready to admit defeat. Perhaps some stories were meant to remain mysteries. Perhaps some truths were lost to history, no matter how desperately we wanted to recover them. Then Dr. Winters arrived carrying a box Sarah had not seen the night before. She explained that she had gone home and thought about Sarah's search, had remembered a collection they had recently acquired from an estate sale. The papers of Eleanor Garrison, a Quaker woman who had operated a boarding house for fugitive slaves. The collection was not yet fully cataloged, but it might contain something relevant. Sarah opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a small leather notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting. The entries were brief and deliberately vague, offering minimal identifying information. But on a page dated February 18, 1858, Sarah found this notation: AF arrived from Charleston. Young woman, educated, expecting. Arrangements made with EM, AF Anna Freeman. The initials matched. Arrived from Charleston in February 1858, exactly when Catherine said Hannah had escaped. Sarah felt her pulse racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. This could be coincidence. AF could be anyone. She continued reading through the notebook, searching for additional mentions. And she found them. July 12, 1858. AF delivered of daughter. Both well. September 3, 1858. AF employed as seamstress. Showing great skill. Sarah sat back, her hands shaking. This had to be Hannah. The details matched too perfectly, but she needed more, needed something that would definitively connect these brief notations to the woman who had escaped from Blackwood Manor. Dr. Winters suggested they search census records. If Hannah had been living in Philadelphia in 1860, she should appear in that year's federal census. They accessed the digitized records through the Society's computer system and began the painstaking work of searching through thousands of entries. After 2 hours, Sarah found what she was looking for. On page 347 of the 1860 census for Philadelphia's 7th Ward. Freeman, Anna, age 28. Seamstress, born South Carolina. Household includes Freeman, Sarah, age 2. Born Pennsylvania. Sarah stared at the screen, hardly breathing. Anna Freeman, born in South Carolina, working as a seamstress, living with a daughter named Sarah, named after Hannah's mother, the woman who had been sold away when Hannah was a child. Hannah had made it. She had escaped from slavery, had given birth to a daughter in freedom, had built a life in Philadelphia. Catherine's sacrifice had not been in vain. But as Sarah continued searching through census records, tracking Hannah through 1870 and 1880, she discovered something that made her pause. The 1870 census showed Anna Freeman living with 2 daughters, Sarah, now 12, and Catherine, age 7. Catherine. Hannah had named her second daughter after the woman who had saved her life. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she photographed the census record. The bond between Hannah and Catherine had transcended death, had been preserved in the name of a child born in freedom, a child who would carry Catherine Blackwood's name into the future. She searched for Anna Freeman's death record and found it dated April 15, 1896. Hannah had lived for 38 years after escaping from Blackwood Manor, had died at 64, surrounded by family. Sarah sat in the quiet research room, overwhelmed by what she had discovered. She had verified Catherine's account, had proven that Hannah achieved freedom, had found evidence of the life Hannah built in Philadelphia. The mystery seemed solved, but Dr. Winters asked a question that changed everything. If Hannah had made it to Philadelphia, if she had lived here for nearly 4 decades, if she had raised 2 daughters who had grown to adulthood in this city, then where were her descendants? Surely some of Hannah's family must still be living in Philadelphia. Surely they would have stories, documents, family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. Sarah felt a jolt of excitement. She had been so focused on verifying the historical record that she had not considered the possibility of living witnesses, people who carried Hannah's story in their family memory. She spent the next 2 days searching Philadelphia phone directories, making calls to anyone named Freeman or Davis or Jones who might be descended from Hannah's daughters. Most calls led nowhere, dead ends or people with no connection to the family she was researching. But on the afternoon of her 3rd day in Philadelphia, she reached a woman named Dorothy Davis who said yes. Anna Freeman had been her great-great-grandmother. She invited Sarah to visit that evening. Dorothy lived in a small row house in West Philadelphia. She was 83, tiny and bright-eyed, her living room filled with family photographs spanning generations. She served Sarah tea and began to talk about Anna Freeman, about the stories that had been passed down through her grandmother and mother. Anna had been a remarkable woman, Dorothy said. Born in slavery, escaped while pregnant, built a life in freedom through determination and courage. She had been helped by someone back in South Carolina, someone who had given her papers and money and hope. Dorothy's grandmother, Sarah, had spoken of this mysterious benefactor with reverence, had said the family owed everything to this person who had risked so much. Sarah asked if Dorothy knew the benefactor's name, and Dorothy shook her head. Her grandmother had never revealed it, had said only that it was someone who had paid a terrible price for helping Anna escape. Then Dorothy went to a back bedroom and returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside were several items: a tarnished locket, an old photograph, letters tied with ribbon, and a small book. A primer, the kind used to teach children to read in the 19th century. Dorothy explained that this had belonged to Anna Freeman, that Anna had treasured it throughout her life and had insisted it be preserved in the family forever. Sarah opened the primer with trembling hands. On the inside front cover was an inscription in elegant script: "To Hannah, with prayers for your safety and freedom. May this book open doors for you that have been closed for too long." May 1843. The inscription was unsigned, but Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Catherine Blackwood's precise script, the same elegant penmanship that filled the journal hidden at Blackwood Manor. May 1843, 15 years before Hannah's escape. Sarah felt her understanding shift dramatically. Catherine had not just helped Hannah escape, she had been preparing her for freedom for 15 years, had taught her to read as a child, had given her this primer when Hannah was perhaps 3 or 4 years old. But that created a problem, a contradiction that Sarah could not immediately explain. According to Catherine's journal, she had arrived at Blackwood Manor in 1852, after marrying Thomas Blackwood. But this inscription was dated 1843, 9 years earlier. Catherine would have been only 17 in 1843, still living in Boston with her family. How could she have given Hannah a primer at Blackwood Manor in 1843, when she did not arrive there until 1852? Sarah felt a cold certainty settling over her. Something was wrong with the timeline, something that did not make sense. Either the inscription was not written by Catherine, or Catherine's journal was not telling the complete truth, or there was another explanation that Sarah had not yet considered. She asked Dorothy if there were any other documents in the family collection, any letters or papers that might explain the discrepancy. Dorothy thought for a moment, then reached into the wooden box and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter, written in the same hand as the primer's inscription. The letter was addressed to Hannah and dated February 1858, just before Hannah's escape. Sarah read it carefully, her confusion growing with each sentence. "My dearest Hannah, by the time you read this, you will be on your way to freedom. I have made all the arrangements I promised, and my sister Margaret will receive you in Philadelphia. You must be brave, as you have always been brave. You must trust in the documents I have provided, and in the network of friends who will help you along the way. But there is something I must tell you before you go, something I have kept from you all these years, because I was afraid of how it might change things between us. You are not just my husband's half-sister. You are my sister as well. We share the same mother." Sarah stopped reading, her mind reeling. She read the passage again, certain she had misunderstood. "When I was 17, I traveled to Charleston with my father on business. While there, I visited Blackwood Manor, as my father had business dealings with Thomas Blackwood Sr. I met a young enslaved woman named Sarah, your mother, who worked in the house. She saw something in me, some similarity perhaps, and one night she came to my room and told me a secret that changed my life forever. Sarah had been born free in Boston. Her mother, my mother, had been a free woman of color who worked as a seamstress. But Sarah's mother had died when Sarah was just a baby, and she had been taken in by a white family, raised alongside their daughter. That daughter was my mother, Hannah. They grew up as sisters. When Sarah was 16, she came to Charleston looking for work. Thomas Blackwood Sr. saw her, wanted her, and found a way to claim she was a fugitive slave from one of his business associates' plantations. He had her enslaved, kept her at Blackwood Manor, used her as he pleased, and there was nothing she could do. No way to prove she had been born free. No family in Boston who knew where she had gone. Sarah told me all this in 1843, begged me to help her. But I was only 17. With no power, no resources. All I could do was give her that primer, promise her that somehow, someday, I would find a way to help her gain freedom. When I returned to Boston, I tried to convince my father to intervene, but he refused. He said there was no proof of Sarah's story, that making accusations against a respected planter like Thomas Blackwood would ruin his business relationships. He forbade me from speaking of it again, but I could not forget. For 9 years I thought about Sarah, about what had happened to her, and when Thomas Blackwood Jr. came to Boston and courted me, I saw an opportunity. I married him not because I loved him, but because it was the only way I could return to Blackwood Manor, the only way I could be in a position to help Sarah. By the time I arrived as Thomas's wife in 1852, Sarah had been dead for 2 years, sold to a plantation in Louisiana after trying to protect you from your father's attentions. She died there, and I never had the chance to fulfill my promise to her. But I could fulfill my promise by helping you. You are my niece, Hannah. You are my blood, and I will not let you suffer the same fate as your mother. This is why I have risked everything to help you escape, why I have been willing to betray my husband, my class, my society, because you are family, and because I failed your mother, and because I will not fail you. Go to Philadelphia. Find my sister Margaret. Live the life your mother should have lived. Be free. Your aunt, Catherine Sarah, sat in Dorothy's living room, the letter trembling in her hands. Everything she thought she understood about the story had just shifted. Catherine had not been a sympathetic white woman moved by abstract principles of justice. She had been family, bound to Hannah by blood, motivated by guilt over failing to save Hannah's mother, determined to make amends by helping Hannah escape. The journal hidden at Blackwood Manor had told only part of the truth. Catherine had concealed the real relationship between herself and Hannah, perhaps because revealing it would have put both of them in even greater danger, perhaps because the truth was too complicated to risk recording. Sarah looked up at Dorothy, whose eyes were bright with tears. Dorothy said her grandmother had told her some of this story, had said that Anna Freeman's real name had been Hannah Blackwood, that she had been the daughter of a free woman who had been illegally enslaved, that she had been helped to freedom by a white aunt who had married into the Blackwood family specifically to be in a position to help. But the family had kept these details private for generations, had been afraid that revealing the truth about Anna's parentage and her relationship to Catherine might somehow put them at risk, even decades after slavery ended. They had told outsiders only that Anna had been born in slavery and had escaped to freedom, had left out the complicated family connections that made the story so much more remarkable. Sarah asked if she could take the letter and the primer to be properly preserved and studied. Dorothy agreed, but only if Sarah promised to tell the complete story, to make sure people understood that Catherine had not just been a benevolent stranger, but family, that she had died trying to save her own niece. Sarah promised, but her mind was already racing ahead to new questions. If Catherine had married Thomas Blackwood specifically to be in a position to help Hannah, if she had spent years planning and preparing for Hannah's escape, then her actions took on an entirely different character. This was not spontaneous courage or impulsive morality. This was calculated, deliberate, long-term resistance. And it raised another question, one that made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. If Thomas Blackwood had discovered that his wife had helped Hannah escape, had he also discovered the real reason Catherine had married him? Had he realized that their entire marriage had been a deception, that Catherine had never loved him, that she had used him to get access to Blackwood Manor? If so, then Catherine's murder took on an even darker dimension. Thomas had not just killed his wife for helping a slave escape. He had killed her for making a fool of him, for deceiving him, for marrying him under false pretenses. Sarah left Dorothy's house that evening with the letter and the primer carefully wrapped in archival paper, her mind churning with implications. She had come to Philadelphia looking for simple verification of Catherine's journal, expecting to find a straightforward story of courage and sacrifice. Instead, she had uncovered something far more complex, a story of family obligation and long-planned resistance, of blood ties that transcended racial boundaries, of a woman who had spent 9 years preparing to fulfill a promise made when she was 17. But she had also uncovered something troubling. If the journal Catherine had hidden at Blackwood Manor had not told the complete truth, what else might Catherine have concealed? What other secrets might still be buried at Blackwood Manor, waiting to be discovered? Sarah flew back to Charleston the next morning, but instead of returning to her hotel, she drove directly to Blackwood Manor. Dr. Foster was surprised to see her, asked about her research in Philadelphia. Sarah showed him the letter and the primer, explained what she had learned about the real relationship between Catherine and Hannah. Dr. Foster examined the documents carefully, his expression growing more troubled as he read. He agreed that this changed everything, that the story was far more complicated than the journal alone suggested. But he also pointed out a problem that Sarah had already begun to worry about. If Catherine had deliberately concealed the truth in her journal, if she had created a false narrative to protect herself and Hannah, then how could they trust anything else she had written? How could they know what was true and what was strategically constructed fiction? Sarah had no answer, but she knew where to look for one. She asked Dr. Foster if she could return to the hidden room in the cellar, if she could examine it more carefully. He agreed, and they descended the narrow stairs together, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The hidden room looked exactly as Sarah had left it. The brick wall with the opening she had created, the empty trunk in the corner. But now Sarah examined it with new eyes, looking not just for what was there, but for what might be missing. She studied the dimensions of the room carefully, measuring the interior space against the exterior walls of the cellar. And she found a discrepancy. The hidden room was smaller than it should be, given the thickness of the walls. There was space unaccounted for, perhaps 18 inches, running along the back wall. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Another false wall, another hidden space within the hidden space. She examined the back wall carefully, running her hands over the brick, pressing on different sections. And she found it. A small area near the floor where the mortar was a slightly different color, where the bricks gave slightly when pressed. Working carefully with a small crowbar, she removed the bricks one by one. Behind them was a narrow space, barely large enough to fit a shoebox. And inside that space was a metal box, rusted but intact. Sarah pulled it out and pried open the corroded lid. Inside were more papers, but these were different from the journal and letters in the trunk. These were official documents. A birth certificate for Sarah Marshall, born in Boston in 1816, to Hannah Marshall, free woman of color, and father unknown. A certificate of manumission for Sarah Marshall, dated 1816, certifying that she had been born free. Legal papers documenting Sarah's employment as a domestic servant in Charleston in 1832. And underneath these documents was a letter dated March 1859, written in Catherine's hand but addressed to no one. If you have found this, then you have also found my journal and letters. You may have read them and believed you understood my story, but you did not have the complete truth. I could not put the complete truth in those documents, because if they had been discovered, if Thomas had found them, he would have destroyed the evidence of Sarah's free birth, would have ensured that no one could ever prove Hannah had been illegally enslaved. So I hid these documents separately, in a place even more secret than the trunk. These papers prove that Hannah's mother Sarah was born free, that she was illegally enslaved by Thomas's father, that Hannah herself should never have been held in bondage. These papers are Hannah's inheritance, her proof of identity, her claim to justice. But I could not give them to her before she escaped, could not risk them being found if she was captured. So I have hidden them here, trusting that if you have found my journal, you will also find these documents, and you will ensure they reach Hannah or her descendants. Tell them the truth. Tell them that Sarah Marshall was free, that she was stolen and enslaved, that the crime committed against her was not just the crime of slavery, but the crime of kidnapping, of false imprisonment, of destroying legal documents to cover up a theft of a human being. And tell them that I am sorry. I am sorry I could not save Sarah. I am sorry I waited 9 years before returning to help. I am sorry that my help came too late for her, and that all I could do was save her daughter. But I am not sorry for what I did. I would do it again, and I go to my death knowing that Hannah is free, that she will live the life her mother should have lived, that these documents will eventually find their way to her or to her children. Let the truth be known. Let justice be served, even if it comes more than a century too late. Sarah sat back on the cold dirt floor of the cellar, the metal box in her lap. These final documents spread before her. The story was complete now. Not just a story of courage and sacrifice, but a story of systemic injustice, of a free woman illegally enslaved, of her daughter born into bondage that should never have existed, of another woman who had spent years planning and executing a rescue. But Sarah also understood why Catherine had structured her testimony this way, why she had hidden different pieces of the truth in different places. If Thomas had found the journal and letters alone, he would have been enraged, but he would not have found proof that could be used against his family in a court of law. The journal could be dismissed as the ravings of a delusional woman. The letters could be interpreted as discussing legitimate business. But these documents, these official certificates and legal papers, could not be dismissed. They were proof that Thomas Blackwood Sr. had committed a crime, had knowingly enslaved a free woman, had falsified records to cover up his theft. If these documents had ever become public during his lifetime or during his son's lifetime, the Blackwood family would have faced prosecution, would have lost everything. Catherine had created a careful structure of revelation. The journal and letters told enough of the story to ensure Hannah's courage would be remembered. But the legal documents, hidden even more carefully, told the truth that could destroy the Blackwood family. It was a final act of revenge against the man who had poisoned her, carefully structured to detonate decades or centuries after her death. Sarah gathered all the documents, photographed everything in place before removing them, created a complete record of both hidden spaces and their contents. Then she and Dr. Foster carefully carried everything upstairs to proper light and safety. As they emerged from the cellar, Sarah glanced back at the dark stairway leading down into the earth. The secrets of Blackwood Manor had been more carefully buried than she had imagined, layered and hidden and protected, but they had also been preserved with extraordinary care, waiting for someone to find them, to understand them, to tell the story they contained. Catherine Blackwood had died in 1859, but her voice had survived. And now, 133 years later, that voice was about to speak to the world. But Sarah could not shake one final question that nagged at her as she stood in the ruined mansion, surrounded by evidence of long-buried truth. If Catherine had been this careful, this deliberate, this strategic in how she concealed and preserved information, what else might still be hidden at Blackwood Manor? What other secrets might be waiting in the walls, in the floors, in the very foundations of this house built on slavery and maintained through violence? The investigation was far from over. In fact, Sarah was beginning to suspect it had barely begun. Sarah Chen stood in the October sunlight on the grounds of Blackwood Manor, watching as television crews set up their equipment for the press conference that would change everything. 6 months had passed since she had found the second hidden compartment in the cellar. 6 months since she had discovered the legal documents proving that Hannah's mother, Sarah, had been born free and illegally enslaved. 6 months of research, verification, consultation with historians and legal experts, preparation of a comprehensive report that would expose not just the story of Catherine and Hannah, but the systematic criminality that had underpinned the Blackwood family fortune. The response to her initial findings had been immediate and intense. Dr. Foster had published a preliminary article in the Journal of Southern History outlining the discovery of Catherine's journal and the evidence of Hannah's escape to Philadelphia. Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers across the country. National Public Radio had produced a segment. The Washington Post had sent a reporter to interview Sarah and Dorothy Davis. CNN had aired a brief piece about the hidden room and the documents it contained. But Sarah had held back the most explosive revelation. She had not yet revealed the legal documents proving Sarah Marshall's free birth. had not yet disclosed Catherine's final letter explaining the full scope of the Blackwood family's crimes. She had wanted time to verify everything, to build an unassailable case, to ensure that when she released this information, it could not be disputed or dismissed. Now she was ready. The press conference had been scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, time to maximize media coverage. Representatives from the South Carolina Historical Society, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Smithsonian Institution were present. Dorothy Davis had traveled from Philadelphia with several other descendants of Hannah Freeman, and standing uncomfortably to one side, looking as if they wished to be anywhere else, were 3 members of the current Blackwood family. Sarah had contacted them 2 weeks earlier, had informed them of what she had discovered and what she planned to reveal. She had given them the opportunity to participate in the press conference, to acknowledge their family's history, to demonstrate their willingness to confront the truth. 2 of them, distant cousins who had never lived at Blackwood Manor and who had only tenuous connections to the main family line, had politely declined. But Robert Blackwood, 78 years old, had accepted. He was the great-great-grandson of Thomas Blackwood, Jr., the man who had murdered Catherine. He had grown up hearing family stories about the plantation's glory days, about the noble ancestors who had built Blackwood Manor and maintained it through war and Reconstruction. He had inherited some family documents and photographs, had taken pride in his lineage, had considered the Blackwood name to be one of honor and distinction. Sarah's discoveries had shattered that comfortable narrative. She had met with Robert twice over the past weeks, had shown him the evidence, had walked him through the timeline of what had happened. She had watched his face as he read Catherine's journal, had seen him flinch when he reached the entry about the poisoning, had observed the way his hands trembled as he examined the legal documents proving Sarah Marshall's free birth. He had not denied anything. He could not. The evidence was overwhelming. But he had asked Sarah one question that had stayed with her. What did she want from him? What did she expect the living descendants of people who had committed these crimes to do? Sarah had not had a good answer. She was a structural engineer and amateur historian, not a moral philosopher or social justice advocate. She knew how to find evidence, how to verify facts, how to construct a narrative from fragmentary sources. But she did not know what justice looked like 133 years after the crimes had been committed, when all the perpetrators were long dead and their descendants were people who bore no personal responsibility for what their ancestors had done. Still, she believed that truth mattered, that acknowledgement mattered, that the act of bringing hidden history into the light had value, even if it could not undo the harm that had been done. The press conference began at precisely 2 o'clock. Dr. Foster spoke first, providing historical context about slavery in South Carolina, about the legal frameworks that had made it possible for people like Thomas Blackwood Sr. to illegally enslave free people, about the Underground Railroad networks that had helped thousands of enslaved people escape to freedom. Then Sarah stepped to the microphone. She had prepared remarks, had written and rewritten them dozens of times, trying to find the right balance between historical detachment and emotional truth. But as she looked out at the assembled reporters and camera crews, at Dorothy Davis and her family, at Robert Blackwood standing with his head bowed, she set her prepared remarks aside. She told the story simply and chronologically. She described finding the hidden room in the cellar, opening the trunk, reading Catherine's journal for the first time. She explained what Catherine had written about Hannah, about the secret lessons in the library, about the discovery that Hannah was Thomas Blackwood Jr.'s half-sister, about the plan to help her escape. She described her trip to Philadelphia, her research in the archives, her discovery of the census records that confirmed Hannah had made it to freedom. She talked about meeting Dorothy Davis, about learning that Hannah had named her daughter Catherine in honor of the woman who had saved her. Then she revealed what she had held back from the earlier reports. She described finding the second hidden compartment, discovering the legal documents that proved Sarah Marshall had been born free in Boston, that she had been illegally enslaved by Thomas Blackwood Sr., that the entire foundation of that branch of the Blackwood family's wealth had been built on kidnapping and fraud, as well as on the institution of slavery itself. She explained Catherine's strategy of hiding different pieces of the truth in different places, creating layers of revelation that would protect the most dangerous information until it could be safely disclosed. She read passages from Catherine's final letter, the one that had been hidden with the legal documents, the one that explained everything. The assembled reporters were silent as Sarah spoke, scribbling notes or recording on devices. When she finished, there was a long moment of quiet before the questions began. A reporter from the Charleston Post and Courier asked if there was any way to verify the authenticity of the documents, if there was any possibility they were forgeries created to discredit the Blackwood family. Sarah had anticipated this question. She explained that the documents had been examined by experts in 19th-century paper, ink, and handwriting. The analysis had confirmed that all the documents were genuine, that they dated from the periods indicated, that the handwriting matched authenticated samples of Catherine's writing from other sources. Moreover, she had found corroborating evidence in other archives, records from Boston confirming Sarah Marshall's birth in 1816 to Hannah Marshall, employment records showing Sarah had worked in Charleston in the 1830s, advertisements that Thomas Blackwood Sr. had placed claiming Sarah was a fugitive slave from a business associate's plantation. Every piece of the story checked out. Every document was authentic. The evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. Another reporter asked about the legal implications. Could the Blackwood family be held accountable for crimes committed by their ancestors more than a century ago? Could Hannah's descendants make claims against the estate? Sarah deferred to a legal expert from the University of South Carolina who had been consulting on the case. The expert explained that while the crimes themselves were well beyond any statute of limitations, and while slavery itself had been constitutionally abolished, there were potential legal avenues for the descendants of people who had been illegally enslaved. Reparations cases had been filed in other contexts, though none had yet succeeded in court. The legal landscape was complex and unsettled, but the expert also pointed out that this case was unique. Most enslaved people had left no documentary trail, no proof of their existence beyond their names in plantation records. But Sarah Marshall's case was different. There were birth certificates, manumission papers, employment records. There was a clear chain of evidence showing that she had been free, that she had been illegally enslaved, that her descendants had been denied the inheritance and opportunities that should have been theirs if their ancestor had remained free. The legal expert suggested that while a court case would be complicated and difficult, it was not impossible. The question was whether Hannah's descendants wanted to pursue such a case and what outcome they hoped to achieve. Dorothy Davis spoke next, her voice quiet but firm. She explained that her family had discussed the possibility of legal action, but they had not yet made a decision. What mattered most to them was not financial compensation but acknowledgement, the recognition that their ancestor had been wronged, that she should never have been enslaved, that the life she had been forced to live was a result of criminal acts rather than the legal institution of slavery. She said that her family wanted the complete story told, wanted Catherine's courage recognized, wanted the truth about the Blackwood family's crimes to become part of the historical record. Whether that truth had legal consequences was secondary to ensuring it was no longer hidden. Then Robert Blackwood stepped to the microphone, and the assembled reporters leaned forward, cameras focusing on his face. He began by acknowledging that everything Sarah had discovered was true, that he had examined the evidence and could not dispute any of it. He said that learning about his ancestors' crimes had been one of the most difficult experiences of his life, that it had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his family history. But he also said something that surprised Sarah. He announced that he and the other surviving members of the Blackwood family had decided to establish a foundation in Catherine's name, dedicated to researching and documenting the stories of people who had been illegally enslaved in the American South. The foundation would be funded by the sale of certain family properties and assets, and it would work to identify other cases like Sarah Marshall's, where free people had been kidnapped and enslaved, where legal documents had been falsified or destroyed to cover up crimes. The foundation would also provide scholarships for descendants of enslaved people who were pursuing higher education, and it would support the preservation and interpretation of historic sites related to slavery and the Underground Railroad. Robert Blackwood said that this was not reparations in any legal sense, that no amount of money could undo the harm his ancestors had caused, that nothing could truly make amends for murder and kidnapping and decades of enslavement. But it was an acknowledgement of responsibility, an attempt to ensure that some good came from the terrible legacy his family had left. The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled reporters. This was not what anyone had expected, not the defensive posture or legalistic denial that often characterized responses to revelations about historical crimes. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her appreciated Robert Blackwood's gesture, recognized it as a meaningful step toward accountability, but part of her also wondered if it was enough, if private philanthropy could ever be an adequate response to systematic injustice, if individual acts of contrition could address structural crimes. Still, it was something. It was more than most families in his position had ever offered. The press conference continued for another hour, with reporters asking questions about the details of the discovery, about the historical context, about what would happen to Blackwood Manor itself. The Historic Preservation Society announced that the house would be restored and open to the public as a museum and educational site, with a permanent exhibition about Catherine and Hannah's story, about the reality of slavery in the antebellum South, about resistance and courage and the long struggle for freedom. The cellar room where the documents had been hidden would be preserved exactly as Sarah had found it, with a false wall partially open to reveal the space beyond, with replicas of the trunk and the metal box in their original positions. Visitors would be able to see where Catherine had hidden her testimony, would be able to understand the care and deliberation with which she had preserved the truth. As the press conference concluded and the reporters began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing with Dorothy Davis and Robert Blackwood, three people whose lives had been unexpectedly entangled by events that had occurred more than a century before they were born. Dorothy reached out and took Robert's hand. She told him that she appreciated what he had announced, that his family's gesture meant something to her family. But she also said that what mattered most was that Catherine and Hannah's story would finally be told, that the truth would become part of the historical record, that future generations would know what had happened at Blackwood Manor. Robert nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He said that he had spent his whole life being proud of his family name, but now he understood that pride had been built on a foundation of lies and crimes. He said he hoped that by acknowledging the truth, by supporting efforts to document other cases of illegal enslavement, his family could begin to write a different legacy. Sarah listened to this exchange with a sense of witnessing something important, something that transcended the historical discoveries she had made. This was about people in the present grappling with the past, trying to find ways to honor the dead and create meaning from tragedy. But even as she stood there, even as she felt the emotional weight of the moment, part of her mind was elsewhere. Because in the weeks leading up to the press conference, as she had been preparing her presentation and coordinating with various institutions and individuals, she had continued to investigate Blackwood Manor. And she had found something else, something that had been nagging at her, something that did not quite fit with the rest of the story. Catherine's journal had ended in March 1859, shortly before her death. The entries had become increasingly fragmented and desperate as her illness progressed, as the poison slowly destroyed her body. But there had been a gap in the journal, several weeks in February 1859 where there were no entries at all, as if Catherine had either been too ill to write or had been prevented from writing. Sarah had assumed this gap was simply a result of Catherine's deteriorating condition, but then she had found something in the South Carolina Historical Society's archives, something that had made her reconsider. It was a letter written in February 1859 by Thomas Blackwood, Jr. to his business associate in Charleston. The letter discussed various plantation matters, crop yields and market prices, and labor management. But it also included a passage that had caught Sarah's attention. "My wife's condition continues to deteriorate, and I fear she will not survive much longer. The physician believes she is suffering from childbed fever, Though I have my doubts about this diagnosis, given that she was never with child, I have been forced to confine her to her room for her own safety and the safety of others, as she has become increasingly delusional and violent in her final days. She makes wild accusations, claims that she is being poisoned, insists that I am trying to murder her. It is most distressing to witness her decline into madness. The letter was dated February 10th, 1859, exactly 1 month before Catherine's death. It was a clear attempt to establish a narrative, to create a documented record that would support the official story of Catherine's death. Thomas Blackwood was laying the groundwork for dismissing anything Catherine might say about being poisoned, was characterizing her as delusional and mentally unstable. But there was something else in the letter, a detail that had made Sarah's skin prickle when she read it. In her delirium, Catherine has been calling out for someone named Patience, begging this person to help her, to take something to safety. I do not know who Patience is, but I suspect it may be one of the house servants whom Catherine has developed an unhealthy attachment to. I have questioned all of the servants, but none will admit to this name. Patience, the enslaved woman who Catherine had mentioned in her final journal entry, the person she had entrusted with hiding the documents after her death. Thomas Blackwood had been looking for Patience, had been trying to find out who she was and what Catherine had given her, but apparently he had failed. The documents had been successfully hidden, and Patience had kept Catherine's secret. Sarah had become obsessed with finding out more about Patience. Who was she? What had happened to her after Catherine's death? Had she remained at Blackwood Manor, or had she been sold? Had she lived to see the end of slavery, to experience freedom? The plantation records that had survived were frustratingly incomplete. There were lists of enslaved people from various years, but the names were often just first names or nicknames, with minimal identifying information. Sarah had found several women named Patience or Patsy or Pat in the records from the 1850s, but there was no way to know which one, if any, had been the person Catherine trusted. But then Sarah had found something in an unexpected place. In the collection of papers that Robert Blackwood had inherited from his family, there was a small notebook that had belonged to Amelia Blackwood, Thomas Jr.'s second wife, whom he had married in 1860, a year after Catherine's death. The notebook was a household account book, recording daily expenses and household management details. But on one page, dated July 1865, just after the end of the Civil War, there was an entry that had made Sarah stop breathing. Patience left today with the other freed slaves. She took nothing with her except a small bundle of her possessions. Before she left, she came to me and said something strange. She said that Mrs. Catherine had been a good woman, that I should know the first Mrs. Blackwood had not died of fever, but had been murdered by my husband. I did not know how to respond to this accusation. Thomas has been dead for 6 months, killed by a heart attack, and I am left alone to manage this ruined plantation and these terrible accusations. Patience said she had proof of what she claimed, documents that Mrs. Catherine had entrusted to her before she died. She said she had hidden these documents and that someday they would be found and the truth would be known. I asked her where the documents were hidden, but she would not tell me. She simply smiled and said that Mrs. Catherine had been clever, that she had ensured the truth would survive, even if it took 100 years. I do not know what to make of this. Part of me wants to dismiss it as the ravings of an ignorant former slave. But part of me has always wondered about the first Mrs. Blackwood's death, about why Thomas would never speak of her, about why he destroyed all her personal belongings after she died. What if Patience is telling the truth? What if my husband was a murderer? The entry ended there, with no indication that Amelia had ever investigated further or tried to find the documents Patience mentioned. Perhaps she had been afraid of what she might discover. Perhaps she had decided it was easier not to know. But the entry confirmed something crucial. Patience had successfully hidden Catherine's documents, had kept the secret for 6 years through the chaos of war and emancipation, and had left Blackwood Manor in 1865 knowing that Catherine's testimony was safely concealed. Sarah had tried to trace what happened to Patience after she left Blackwood Manor, but the trail was almost impossible to follow. Millions of formerly enslaved people had moved during and after the Civil War, searching for family members, looking for opportunities, trying to build new lives in freedom. Record-keeping was minimal, and many people changed their names or moved frequently, making them nearly impossible to track through historical documents. But Sarah had kept searching, and 3 days before the press conference, she had found something in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. In the records for Charleston, South Carolina, dated October 1865, there was a brief entry: Patience Blackwood, age approximately 45, formerly enslaved at Blackwood Manor, seeking information about family members. Has 2 daughters believed to have been sold to plantations in Georgia in 1855. Bureau unable to locate daughters. Patience employed as laundress, residing at 118 Meeting Street. Patience Blackwood. She had taken the surname of the family that had enslaved her, as many formerly enslaved people did, though whether out of necessity or choice, Sarah could not determine. She had been searching for her daughters, children who had been sold away a decade earlier and who might be anywhere in the South or might be dead. The entry provided no information about whether Patience ever found her daughters, no indication of what became of her after October 1865. But it proved she had survived the war, had remained in Charleston at least for a few months after emancipation, had been trying to rebuild a family that had been torn apart by slavery. Sarah wondered if Patience had known that Catherine's documents were not just about Hannah, not just about the illegal enslavement of Sarah Marshall. Catherine had been documenting a whole system, a whole structure of violence and exploitation that had destroyed countless families like Patience's. Had Patience understood that by hiding those documents, by keeping Catherine's secret, she was preserving testimony that went beyond one woman's story? Had she seen herself as part of a larger resistance, a larger struggle for truth and justice? Sarah would never know. Patience's inner life, her thoughts and feelings and motivations, were lost to history. All that remained was her action, the simple fact that she had hidden the documents and had kept the secret and had ensured that Catherine's voice would survive. Now, standing on the grounds of Blackwood Manor as the press conference concluded, as reporters filed their stories and camera crews packed up their equipment, Sarah felt the weight of all these interconnected lives pressing down on her. Catherine and Hannah and Sarah Marshall and Patience and Margaret and Eleanor Garrison and all the others who had played some role in this story, whose courage and sacrifice and suffering had made it possible for Hannah to escape, for the truth to be preserved, for justice to have some small chance of being served more than a century later. But she also felt the weight of incompleteness, of all the stories that had not been recovered, of all the Patiences and Sarahs who had disappeared into historical silence without leaving any trace. For every case like Hannah's where there were documents and evidence and a trail to follow, there were thousands where there was nothing, where people had been enslaved and had died and had been forgotten, where their voices had been silenced forever. The work of excavating hidden history was important, but it was also overwhelming in its impossibility. No matter how many archives she searched, how many documents she found, how many stories she recovered, it would always be a tiny fraction of the truth, a few voices rescued from an ocean of silence. Sarah walked back toward the main house as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the grounds. Dr. Foster had asked her to join him for a final inspection of the cellar before the restoration work began in earnest. The plan was to stabilize the structure, preserve the hidden rooms exactly as they had been found, create a space where visitors could see where Catherine had hidden her testimony. They descended the narrow stairs into the cool darkness of the cellar, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The hidden room looked smaller now than it had when Sarah had first discovered it, almost claustrophobic in its tight dimensions. She tried to imagine Catherine down here in the darkness, carefully placing the documents in the trunk, building the false wall, creating the layers of concealment that would protect her truth for 133 years. Dr. Foster was examining the brickwork, taking measurements, making notes for the restoration crew. Sarah stood in the center of the room, sweeping her flashlight slowly across the walls. And then she saw it. Something she had missed before, something that had been invisible in the shadows but that became clear now as her light hit it at just the right angle. There were marks on the wall, not the random scratches and imperfections of old brick, but deliberate marks carved into the mortar between the bricks. Letters, words. Sarah moved closer, her heart pounding. The letters were crude, scratched with something sharp, probably a nail or piece of metal. The handwriting was nothing like Catherine's elegant script, but the message was clear. Patience was here. 1859. Below that, in the same rough lettering, Mrs. Catherine was good, and below that, smaller and harder to read. Truth will come. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the wall. Patience had left her own testimony, her own message carved into the brick of the hidden room. She had been here after Catherine's death, had successfully concealed the documents, had added her own voice to Catherine's, and she had believed that the truth would eventually emerge, that someday someone would find this room and would read these messages and would understand what had happened. Sarah called Dr. Foster over, showed him the markings on the wall. He examined them carefully, photographed them from multiple angles, made detailed notes. These would need to be preserved as carefully as the documents themselves, he said. They were evidence not just of what had happened, but of resistance, of the determination of enslaved people to leave some record of their existence, to speak across the centuries even when they had been denied literacy, education, legal rights. As they stood there in the hidden room, Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the story. This had never been just about Catherine, just about one white woman's courage in helping one enslaved woman escape. It had always been about a larger network of resistance, about enslaved people and free people working together, about the determination to preserve truth and achieve justice, even when the odds were overwhelming. Patience had been as much a part of this story as Catherine. She had risked as much, had shown as much courage, had been as crucial to ensuring that the truth survived. But until this moment, she had been almost invisible in the narrative, mentioned only briefly in Catherine's journal, reduced to a supporting character in someone else's story. Now Patience had her own voice, literally carved into the wall of Blackwood Manor. 3 simple sentences that transformed everything. Sarah photographed the markings carefully, made detailed notes about their location and appearance. She asked Dr. Foster if there might be other markings elsewhere in the cellar, other messages that had been left by enslaved people who had lived and worked at Blackwood Manor. They spent the next 2 hours examining every inch of the cellar walls, and they found more. Not much, just fragments, but enough to suggest that the cellar had been a space where enslaved people had occasionally left evidence of their presence, their thoughts, their resistance. There were initials carved into bricks in various locations. There were tally marks on one wall, perhaps counting days or weeks or months. There was a crude drawing of what might be a ship, possibly representing hope for escape. And in one corner, so faint it was almost invisible, there were words that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "We were here, we were human, remember us." The messages were undated, and there was no way to know who had carved them or when. But they spoke across the decades with a desperate urgency, a need to be remembered, to have their humanity acknowledged, to leave some trace that would survive the system that had tried to reduce them to property. Sarah understood now that the story of Blackwood Manor was not just about Catherine and Hannah and the documents hidden in the cellar. It was about all the people who had lived and worked and suffered and resisted in this place, most of whom had left no documentary trace, no records beyond their names in plantation ledgers, no voices preserved in journals or letters. But they had left these messages, carved into brick and mortar, hidden in darkness, waiting for someone to find them and read them and remember. The exhibition that would eventually open at Blackwood Manor would need to include these messages, Sarah told Dr. Foster. Visitors needed to see them, needed to understand that resistance took many forms, that the preservation of truth and memory was not just the work of educated white women who had access to paper and pens, but also the work of enslaved people who used whatever tools they had to leave evidence of their existence. Dr. Foster agreed. The entire cellar would be part of the museum, he said. Visitors would descend the same narrow stairs that Sarah had descended, would see the hidden rooms and the messages on the walls, would understand the layers of concealment and revelation that had preserved this history. As they climbed back up to ground level, emerging into the late afternoon sunlight, Sarah felt both exhausted and energized. The press conference had been just the beginning. The real work of interpreting this site, of telling these stories, of ensuring that the truth was presented in all its complexity, was still ahead. But she also knew that she could not do this work alone. The story of Blackwood Manor belonged to many people, to the descendants of those who had been enslaved here, to historians and educators, to the broader community grappling with the legacy of slavery in the American South. Sarah's role had been to find the hidden documents, to verify their authenticity, to piece together the narrative that Catherine had carefully constructed. But the work of deciding what that narrative meant, how it should be presented, what lessons should be drawn from it, that work would require many voices, many perspectives, many difficult conversations. Over the following months, as the restoration of Blackwood Manor progressed and as plans for the museum exhibition were developed, Sarah participated in numerous meetings and discussions about how to interpret the site. There were debates about what stories to emphasize, about how to balance the narrative of Catherine's courage with the broader context of slavery's violence, about how to represent the experiences of enslaved people without reducing them to victims, about how to acknowledge the complexity and contradictions of the past without excusing or minimizing its injustices. Dorothy Davis and other descendants of Hannah Freeman were actively involved in these discussions, bringing family perspectives and oral histories that complicated and enriched the documentary record. Robert Blackwood also participated, representing a family perspective that was grappling with the revelation of ancestral crimes and trying to find ways to acknowledge responsibility without appropriating the stories of those who had been harmed. The process was difficult and sometimes contentious. There were disagreements about language, about emphasis, about what stories to tell and how to tell them. But gradually, through compromise and collaboration, an interpretation began to emerge that felt true to the complexity of what had happened at Blackwood Manor. The museum would tell multiple stories: Catherine's story of resistance and sacrifice, Hannah's story of escape and survival and the life she built in freedom, Patience's story of courage and loyalty and determination to preserve truth, the stories of other enslaved people who had lived and worked at Blackwood Manor, whose names survived in plantation records, or whose messages had been carved into cellar walls. But the museum would also tell the story of Thomas Blackwood Sr. and Jr., of the system of slavery they had perpetuated and profited from, of the crimes they had committed. It would not shy away from the violence and exploitation that had made places like Blackwood Manor possible. It would not present a sanitized or romanticized version of the past. The museum would be a place of truth-telling, uncomfortable and necessary, preserving evidence of both the worst and best of human behavior, creating space for visitors to grapple with difficult questions about justice and responsibility and memory. Sarah continued her research even as the museum planning progressed. She had become interested in tracking down other cases like Sarah Marshall's, other instances where free people had been illegally enslaved. The foundation that Robert Blackwood had established provided funding for this work, and Sarah found herself traveling to archives across the South, searching for evidence of crimes that had been carefully concealed, finding fragments of stories that had been hidden for generations. She found dozens of cases. Some were well documented, with birth certificates and manumission papers that proved free birth. Others were more ambiguous, with only circumstantial evidence or family oral histories to suggest illegal enslavement. But each case represented a person whose life had been stolen, whose freedom had been taken through fraud and violence, whose descendants had been denied the opportunities and inheritance that should have been theirs. Sarah documented each case carefully, creating a database that would eventually be made available to researchers and descendants seeking information about their ancestors. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, but it was also deeply meaningful. Every name recovered, every story preserved, was an act of resistance against the historical erasure that slavery had attempted to enforce. And as she worked, Sarah often thought about Catherine and Patience, about the care they had taken to preserve truth, about their faith that someday someone would find what they had hidden and would ensure it was not forgotten. That faith had been justified. The truth had survived. The voices had been heard. The museum at Blackwood Manor opened to the public on March 15, 2025, exactly 166 years after Catherine Blackwood's death. Sarah stood in the entrance hall, watching as visitors entered and began to explore the exhibition. Some moved quickly through the rooms, taking in the broad outlines of the story. Others stopped to read every placard, to examine every document and photograph, to absorb the details. Many visitors descended into the cellar, walking carefully down the narrow stairs, entering the hidden room where Catherine had concealed her testimony. They stood in that small space, reading the messages carved into the walls, trying to imagine what it had been like to hide documents here in darkness and secrecy, trusting that someday truth would emerge. Sarah overheard visitors talking as they moved through the museum. Some were descendants of enslaved people, connecting their family stories to the broader historical narrative. Some were descendants of slaveholding families, grappling with the legacy of their ancestors' participation in slavery. Some were educators, bringing students to learn about this history. Some were simply curious, drawn by news coverage of the discovery and wanting to understand what had happened here. The conversations were not always comfortable. There were tears and anger and disagreement. But there was also recognition, acknowledgement, a willingness to confront difficult truths. On opening day, there was a special ceremony in the garden behind the main house. A memorial had been erected, listing the names of all the enslaved people who had lived and worked at Blackwood Manor, whose names could be recovered from plantation records. There were 347 names, spanning more than a century, from the earliest enslaved people brought to the property in the 1790s to those who gained freedom when slavery ended in 1865. Dorothy Davis spoke at the ceremony, representing Hannah's descendants. She talked about what it meant to her family to see their ancestors' story recognized, to know that Hannah had not been forgotten, to understand the courage of both Hannah and Catherine. She also talked about Patience, about the woman who had kept Catherine's secret and had left her own message carved into the cellar wall. She said that Patience represented thousands of enslaved people, whose names were known but whose stories had not survived, who had resisted in ways large and small, who had preserved their humanity and dignity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. Robert Blackwood also spoke, his voice trembling with emotion. He acknowledged his family's crimes, expressed gratitude that the truth had finally been revealed, and committed to continuing the work of documenting cases of illegal enslavement and supporting education about slavery's legacy. Then everyone gathered around the memorial as a group of singers performed spirituals that had been sung by enslaved people in South Carolina, songs of sorrow and hope, of suffering and resistance, of faith that someday freedom would come. As Sarah listened to the music, she felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The chance discovery in the cellar, the months of research and verification, the difficult conversations and compromises, the gradual emergence of a story that had been hidden for more than a century. She thought about Catherine, dying in that locked room, believing that Hannah had achieved freedom but never knowing for certain, trusting that someday the truth would be revealed. She thought about Hannah, building a life in Philadelphia, naming her daughters Sarah and Catherine, preserving the primer that had taught her to read, passing down the story of the white ant who had saved her. She thought about Patience, carving her message into the cellar wall, leaving evidence that would survive long after she was gone. And she thought about all the others whose names appeared on the memorial, whose stories had not been preserved, who had lived and worked and died at Blackwood Manor without leaving any trace beyond a notation in a plantation ledger. The work of remembering them, of honoring them, of ensuring that their lives mattered, was ongoing. It would never be complete, but it was necessary. As the ceremony concluded and visitors began to disperse, Sarah walked one final time down to the cellar. She stood in the hidden room, her flashlight illuminating the rough brick walls, the carved messages, the spaces where Catherine's documents had been concealed. She thought about what Catherine had written in her final letter. Let the truth be known. Let justice be served, even if it comes more than a century too late. The truth was known now. Whether justice had been served was a more complicated question, one that probably had no simple answer. But at least the silence had been broken. At least the voices had been heard. Sarah turned off her flashlight and stood in the darkness for a moment, listening to the old house settle and creak around her. Then she climbed the stairs back to the light, back to the present, carrying with her the weight and gift of the stories she had uncovered. The secrets of Blackwood Manor had been revealed, and in that revelation, something had been restored. Not the lives that had been lost, not the years that had been stolen, not the suffering that could never be undone, but memory, truth, recognition of what had happened and who had been harmed and who had resisted. It was not enough, but it was something. And sometimes, Sarah thought as she emerged into the March sunlight, sometimes that was all we could offer to the past. The promise that we would remember, that we would tell the truth, that we would not let the silence win. The dead could not speak for themselves, but we could speak for them. And in speaking, we could ensure that they were not forgotten, that their lives mattered, that their courage endured. That was the work. That was what Catherine and Hannah and Patience had trusted would happen. And that trust, Sarah believed, had not been misplaced. The story had been told. The truth had survived, and the voices from the darkness had finally found their way to the light.